Mr. Speaker, on January 31st, I asked the Minister of Justice about the need to take concrete steps regarding the report of the Special Committee on Violence Against Aboriginal Women. Unfortunately, the question was evaded, as usual. It's really, truly shameful that Conservatives try to hide the fundamental systemic violence and, as a result, are perpetuating it. So I am therefore taking this opportunity to come back to the subject, as we need to take action to avoid having to start over and produce another report that will unfortunately just be ignored, as those we've produced in the past have done. So simply put, we need action, and there's no lack of ideas. So here's a few of them. To begin with, we need to support sharing of information and culture with agencies, police, lawyers, and social workers, and information and outreach on violence and prevention and available resources such as shelters. We need respectful relationships with police to proactively work with communities and First Nation citizens to ensure they are supported, protected, and feel comfortable reporting crime. We need to support collaborative approaches to policing and sentencing that recognize the community and family roles of both victims and offenders. We desperately need funding. We need adequate funding for services and emergency and second stage shelters in First Nation communities, as well as in rural and urban areas off reserve. We need funding for organizations and programs that are run or directed by Indigenous women themselves. We need economic security and access to housing for women and children, which provides a greater safety and autonomy, including the ability to make choices that will take them away from violent situations. We need support, like resource people in communities, family violence workers, counselors, social supports. Adequate funding and capacity are required as well, and support mechanisms and interventions are needed for the families of women at high risk of violence. We need attention and focus on youth, including support to develop self-respect and respect for others, and ensure access to traditional teachings and parenting role models using tools such as sports. We need to ensure women and girls have political, economic, and social power, and that traditional roles are restored. We need systems and supports that need to reflect First Nations cultures and teachings, and ensure that elders are supported and integrated into solutions. We need accountability, Mr. Speaker. We need a Royal Commission to investigate incidences of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including the high rates of missing and murdered women. We now know what needs to be done, Mr. Speaker. We have known for a long time. So when will the government agree to take concrete steps and agree to an inquiry to end violence against Aboriginal women?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for giving me the opportunity to restate the commitment of the Government of Canada to addressing this important matter, as expressed most recently in October's speech from the throne opening this current session of Parliament. The Government is deeply concerned about the disproportionate levels of violence faced by Indigenous women and girls in Canada, and about the disturbingly vast number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This concern is shared by Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and I'm sure by members of all sides of this House. Simply put, it is unacceptable that any woman or child in Canada should have to face violence in the course of their daily lives. I stand here now to say that using violence against another person is wrong. As parents, we tell our children to find better ways to express anger and frustration. It's even less acceptable when adults who have not learned to take responsibility for their own needs and emotions seek instead to take them out on someone more vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, I fully agree with the member opposite that concern and words alone are simply not enough. More needs to be done to build on the important work of awareness and prevention of this problem. Public awareness campaigns like Don't Be a Guy and Be More Than a Bystander, and other demonstrations of leadership on this issue, such as the personal pledge to live violence-free, taken by the chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations, emphasize that there can be no observers in this struggle. Everyone has to play a role in ending violence. The Government of Canada is keenly aware that leadership through action is needed before more lives are lost and more families and communities are devastated. The Government has answered that call for leadership in 4 ways. First, using violence against another person is more than socially unacceptable and morally reprehensible. It's a crime. As part of its responsibility for the criminal law in Canada, this Government has made a number of changes to ensure that offenders are held accountable for their crimes against others. For example, amendments made by the Safe Streets and Communities Act promote safety and security to ensure criminals are held fully accountable for their actions through increased penalties for violent crimes. restrictions on the use of conditional sentences and house arrest for serious and violent crimes, and increased penalties for child sexual offences. Next, the member opposite asked if the government will support the plan of opposition to take concrete action to end violence against Indigenous women. I would remind the House that the government already announced a plan to take concrete action in this area in October of 2010 with the 7-step strategies totaling $25 million over 5 years to reduce violence against Indigenous women and children and increase community safety as a criminal justice priority. The current strategy ends in March of next year, and the government has already announced its intention to make renewed efforts in this area. The current strategy has produced some significant results, including a new National Centre for Missing Persons and Unidentified Remains, responding to a resolution of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police asking for federal leadership. The Centre has done an incredible amount of work to help improve police responses, launched a new national website to encourage tips, and much more. Extensive work with Aboriginal communities toward the development of the community-specific safety plans, support for culturally appropriate victim services in 7 provinces and territories, including family of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Support for awareness activities by community organizations and for novel approaches aimed at reducing the vulnerability of Indigenous women and girls, and a new online resource for Aboriginal communities looking to address specific challenges which highlight some of the more innovative measures to reduce violence designed by Aboriginal communities in Canada. These targeted actions were based on recommendations from many more of the 45 studies, commissions, inquiries, and other reports that already exist on this issue and that emphasize the need for action. These studies and inquiries also form the basis for other work, including significant investments by the Government of Canada over recent years to address some of the underlying factors identified as the root causes of greater vulnerability to violence, including the economic development, education, family violence programming, policing, and other relevant areas. The concrete actions in the October 2010 announcement also complement other coordinated action taken by federal, provincial, and territorial partners working with Aboriginal people and other stakeholders. For example, dedicated police task force has been established in several jurisdictions to address the unsolved murders, such as Project Even-Handed and Project EPAN in BC, Project CARE in Alberta, and Project Devote in Manitoba. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to respond to this question.
Honorable Député de Argent-Papineau-Mirabel.
Mr. Speaker, these women simply deserve better. They deserve better than excuses and obfuscation from the Conservatives, and they deserve better than a laundry list of things that are supposedly being done. But we all know here that there's actually no new things being committed, even though we know there are plenty of things that still need to be done. We don't need another ineffective committee report and a list of the government's meager investments that do nothing but prove the harsh funding inequities that are keeping First Nations communities down in a colonial framework. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the report coming from the special committee is going to be any better than the one that came out of 2011, the report of the Status of Women Committee on ending violence against Aboriginal women and girls. In 2011, I tabled the NDP's dissenting report, which highlighted the actions that were needed. And the NDP is continuing to demand action. We've put on the table plenty of concrete steps to finally get justice for our sisters. But meanwhile, Conservative budgets are telling a completely different story with no new investments to really solve the problem. So could the Parliamentary Secretary confirm that they will actually be supporting motion M444 by my NDP colleague from Churchill that specifically calls for a public inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government shares the outrage of all Canadians that this situation exists. We have committed to concrete action to resolve this issue and renewed that commitment in the recent speech from the throne. Thanks to the extensive number of reports and recommendations, along with the testimony from expert witnesses at the special committee tasked with studying this issue exclusively, we have a good idea of what needs to change, but the reality is that the causes of the violence are complex, and lasting change will require coordinated and sustained attention from federal, provincial, and territorial governments working together with Aboriginal people and other shareholders to develop more effective and appropriate solutions on a community-by-community basis. This government will continue to seek further information and advice on what is and is not working. However, this era of fiscal restraint, when tough choices must be made about priorities, we cannot agree that a major inquiry with yet another report is the responsible or proactive way to move forward to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. I would close with the words of a 2005 BC report entitled Research to Death. It is important to note that the amount of time and the countless years of advocating have all led to similar findings, directions, and approaches that need to be acted upon rather than becoming just another report on Aboriginal women and violence. The government chooses to focus on taking concrete action now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.